Alright guys, we are going to start with Unit 2, which is solving equations and inequalities. We're just going to start with the equations first, and then once we get through the equations, then we'll move on to our inequalities. Now, you all should know enough about equations to get started. However, we are going to begin with solving one-step equations, and then we'll work our way to multi-step equations. Now, keep in mind that an equation, the definition of an equation, is a mathematical sentence with an equal sign. And when solving equations, you're not changing the values, you're manipulating the equation to create equivalent equations that results in your answer or your solution, which is your x or your y or whatever variable you have in your problem. Now, when starting out with one-step equations, you must keep in mind you are using the inverse operation to undo the equation. That's how we solve for the variable. So even when we get into more difficult equations, you have to think of the order of operations backwards. How can I undo what has been done to the variable? And inverse is like opposite. So the opposite of addition would be subtraction. So the inverse of addition is subtraction. So we're going to start out with a really easy equation. So let's start with our first example here. 15 plus s equals 42. 15 plus s equals 42. So one step, very simple, we're trying to solve for s. We have to analyze what type of number or what's going on with the s. And right now, with the s, we are adding a 15. And more specifically, we're adding a positive 15. It's understood to be positive because there's not a sign there in front of it. So what we need to do is we need to undo this operation. So the opposite of a positive is a negative. So the opposite of adding that positive 15 would be to subtract 15. Now, for those of you that understand this and you're moving along with this example, that's fine. But if you need some more step-by-step directions, please make sure you stay with me. I like to subtract or add or whatever operation vertically. You can set yours up differently if you wish, but this is how I like to set up my equations, because I can clearly see now that I have a positive 15 and a negative 15. When I add those, or when I subtract those, actually, that becomes 0. So I no longer have that. So now what I have is a positive s equals, I don't have to put that plus there because it's understood to be positive s. And then you have to subtract your 42 and your 15. So make sure if you're using your calculator that you do that carefully. But you should get 27. So very simple, very easy one-step equation. So let's try this one. We have a negative 12 plus x equals 17. So a little bit different than the last one. We are still adding a number to our variable. We still have that plus sign, but the difference is we have a negative 12 now instead of a positive 12. So we just have to be very careful there. The opposite of a negative 12, to undo that, would be a positive 12. Even though that's a plus sign there in front of the x, that plus sign actually goes with the x, not the number. We have to do the opposite of the sign in front of the number. So the opposite of a negative 12 is a positive 12. So add 12. But you all have learned this. Of course, we just did it on the last example. But no matter what you do with an equation, you have to do the same thing to both sides. We have to keep it equivalent. We have to keep it balanced. So whatever you do to one side of an equation, no matter what that is, you have to do the same thing to the other side. So if I add 12 to the left side, I have to add 12 there to the right side. So you're adding 12 to 17. The negative 12 and the positive 12, that's going to give us 0. That's the point of doing the opposite there, or the inverse. So we're left with our positive x equals, add 17 and 29, or 17 and 12, and you get 29. So very, very simple one-step equations. Okay? So now what I want you to do is I'm going to put a couple of equations up here that I want you to try. So once you get these written down, I want you to pause the video and try to solve them. And once you've got them answered, resume the video and check your answers. So here's the two problems. Question 1, I want you to try m minus 8 equals negative 14. And the second one I want you to try is y plus 2 equals negative 6. So get those written, pause the video, and try to answer those. Now, hopefully you paused the video and you are coming back to check your answers. If you feel like comfortable and you've got the answer and you feel really good about it, then go ahead and move on through the video. If not, then you need to watch me as I go through these two examples. So for the first one, if that is m minus 8, we are subtracting 8 from the m. So the inverse or the opposite of that would be to add 8, making sure that what we do to one side we do to the other. So add 8 to both sides. Negative 8 and positive 8, that's going to give us the 0 that we need. So we're left with our positive m. M's not wanting to write very well. And then you're going to add 8 to your negative 14, which gives you negative 6. Now be very careful, because if you subtract 8 from both sides, you will definitely not get negative 6, so make sure you're careful with your inverse operation. Now for number 2, we are adding 2 to y, so fairly simple. The inverse of adding 2 would be to subtract 2, and what we do to one side, make sure you do to the other. Adding 2, subtracting 2, these are inverses, so that becomes our 0, which leaves us with our y. And when you subtract 2 from a negative 6, you get negative 8. Now if you're putting that in your calculator, be careful. That is a negative 6 minus 2. That's not negative 6 minus a negative 2. There's not two signs there for your problem. There's just one sign there. So when you type it in, negative 6 minus 2, that's what you need to be typing in your calculator if you need to. Alright, so hopefully you did well on those two. If not, you may want to back up and review yourself. But we're going to move on to multiplication and division now. So for multiplication and division, we're going to do our first problem here. 2x equals 3/5. So throw a fraction in there on this one. 2x equals 3/5. First thing you have to remember, and I'll say this a lot, and you'll do this a lot throughout the next few years, you've got to know what it means when a number and a variable are side by side. Number and variable side by side. This means multiplication. I could put a multiplication dot there if I wanted to. However, you're not going to see multiplication like that in most cases. Occasionally you'll see x's for multiplication, but since we're in algebra now, you're going to see x's as variables and not multiplication. So side by side, a number right next to that variable indicates multiplication. So the inverse of multiplying by 2 would be to divide by 2. Now what you have to be really careful of here in this problem, whenever you go to solve this, you know 2 divided by 2 is 1. Don't tell me you get 0, okay? You get 1. 2 divided by 2 is 1, but that leaves you with 1x. So that's why we have a 1 there, because we still have that x. It does exist. But be careful when you type this in your calculator, because you've got 3/5, which is your fraction, divided by 2. So when you type that in your calculator, you've got to be very careful with your notations. So when you type in your calculator 3/5 divided by 2, you should get 3/10. And that's your answer. Simple multiplication problem. Now let's look at this one. X over 5 equals negative 12. Now, just like you have to remember a number right next to a variable indicates multiplication, you've got to remember that whenever you have a variable or a number, whatever's on top, whatever your numerator is, over a denominator, this bar indicates division. So the opposite of dividing would be to multiply. Now, when you're multiplying, this is where some people have a little trouble. It is like a fraction. You're multiplying by 5, but you're not just multiplying the 5 and the x. Okay? You are multiplying 5 and x, but if you thought of this as a fraction, it's like 5 over 1. And going back to middle school, multiplying fractions is multiply straight across. So 5 times x and 1 times 5. Okay? What this looks like, just for future reference, is 5x over 5. That's what you get whenever you multiply that side by 5. Now don't forget that you are multiplying this other side over here by 5 as well. Don't lose that part of your equation. But what I want you to see here is that when you're multiplying by 5, you're multiplying the numerator by 5 and the denominator by 1, because we're getting into fractions here. So 5 over 5, that's what gives us our 1. That's how come these 5's up here could eliminate. I could go back up there and skip this step here if I wanted to and just mark these out. But I want you to understand why you can just mark those out. So you're left with your 1x, and no matter which one of these you do, whether you are solving it that way or just jumping straight down here to your answer, it doesn't really matter. But when you multiply your negative 12 times your 5, you do get a negative 60. So multiplication and division. Just one-step multiplication and division problems. So what I would like for you all to do, I'm going to put a couple of multiplication and problems, a multiplication and a division up here that I'd like for you all to try. So here's your first one. 10 equals 15x. And the second one I want you to try is 19 equals r over 9. So pause the video once you get those written and try those two problems. Alright, hopefully you've paused the video and we're going to get into this. We're going to just, the opposite of multiplying that 15 and that x there, the opposite of that is to divide. So what I do to one side of my equation, I have to make sure I do to the other. So I'm going to divide both sides by 15. I'm actually going to put my answer over here since I'm running out of room. But you do wind up with a decimal. You can change that decimal to a fraction, which is good practice on this one, because if you've typed 10 divided by 15 in your calculator, you get 0.6 repeating. So it's important that you change that one to a fraction, which is 2/3. You do not want to write repeating decimals. You always want to write those as fractions. If it's a terminating decimal like 0.75, it's okay to leave that way, but otherwise you need to transfer that to a fraction. Now on question number 2, we're dividing by 9, so the opposite would be to multiply both sides by 9. So if I multiply 9 times my 19, you should have gotten 171, which equals r. So 2 answers there for your problems. Now, for your summary, what I need you to do for your summary, which should be at the bottom of your notes. Here is your summary question. When solving a one-step equation, how do you know which operation to use in order to isolate the variable? I'll say it again. When solving a one-step equation, how do you know which operation to use in order to isolate the variable? Be sure to place your summary to this video in the summary box of your notes. Your answer must be clear and concise, and the teacher, whether that's me or Miss Lacey or whoever your teacher is, must check off your summary and notes before you move on to your task.